Intanto mi presento, sono Marica Remoli, l'addetta stampa della Festa di Scienza e Filosofia e ho l'onore di presentare il professor John Harris, che è il secondo anno che viene a trovarci qua alla Festa di Scienza ed è un momento molto importante perché ci permette di fare un raffronto tra la comunità scientifico-filosofica del Regno Unito e la nostra, quella italiana. Il professor Harris è direttore dell'Istituto di Scienza, Etica e Innovazione dell'Università di Manchester, dove insegna anche bioetica. E come vi dicevo prima, questa sera ci parlerà di... questa sera ci parlerà di scienza e democrazia. Il professor Harris in questo momento mi diceva oggi che è impegnato nella scrittura di un libro che ha molto a che fare con i temi di cui ci parlerà oggi, e questo libro si chiama How to be Good, ovvero come essere buoni, e spiega come la scienza sia in grado di creare quelle condizioni affinché l'uomo possa condurre una vita moralmente corretta. E questo ha molto a che fare anche con il concetto di scienza che produce democrazia, che produce libertà, di cui il professor Harris ci parlerà fra poco. Quindi io chiuderei qui e lascio la parola al professor Harris, che ringrazio ancora per essere tornato a trovarci, e vi lascio insomma alla sua conferenza Scienza e Democrazia. Grazie.
Grazie mille. Thank you very much. It is wonderful to be back in Foligno for the second year running. I cannot have disgraced myself last year because I am here again. And I think this is one of the most interesting events that I am privileged to attend. This particular festival of science is unique in prioritizing the contribution of young people and in taking seriously all of the multiple dimensions of science and society. So for me, it is a great privilege to be back here. Now, this evening, I am going to be talking, this talk is about a number of important issues, and I hope I can make them make sense together. It is about science. It is about the freedom to pursue scientific inquiry. But it is also about political freedom, and it finally is a little bit about democracy. Now, the institute that I co-direct in Manchester is called the Institute for Science, Ethics and Innovation. I'm a professional philosopher, but my co-director of the institute is John Sulston, who won the Nobel Prize in 2002 for his work on sequencing the genome, and particularly in identifying the phenomenon of programmed cell death. So I work closely with a very eminent scientist, and the purpose of our institute is to bring science and society together and to explore the ways in which science and policy interconnect. So that is sort of the background. Now, when we founded the institute about 7 years ago now, John Sulston and I gave a joint lecture in Oxford, and we started with these words, and I'm going to repeat them today and then explain them a little because they interconnect with our subject. We started by saying, in the future, there will be no more human beings, and in the future, there will be no more planet Earth. But this is not necessarily something that we should worry about. Now, just let me explain what we meant by that. Neither John nor I, and I think many people who've studied these issues, think that evolution is finished. What is finished, probably, is Darwinian evolution, because it is far too slow. But we now have the possibility of humanly chosen evolution, what I call enhancement evolution, to direct the further evolution of our species. And we may hope that this will be successful, because if we are to survive, we need to be much smarter, much more durable, much healthier, certainly, than we humans are currently. Not least because there are always new diseases arising, not to mention all of the old ones. Many diseases mutate, and I will come to that issue in a minute. And finally, we know that this planet will cease to exist. It's a few 100 million years hence, but what's a few 100 million years between friends? And when the sun dies and this planet ceases to be habitable, we will either have to find a new planet on which to live, and you heard about that in the last session of the afternoon, those of you who were here, or we will have to possibly build a new planet for ourselves or our successors to live on. And one of the reasons that we need science is because we hope that it will help us to meet the new dangers that our species or our further evolved species will face, and ultimately we will need it to find a new place to live. The problem is that science is a mixed blessing. Human beings, for many millennia, have been an endangered species, a species in danger of being wiped out by competitors. But now we ourselves have become an endangering species, a species that actually are threatening not only our fellow humans, but the planet itself. And science and technology are one of the causes that we have become such an endangering group of individuals. This preamble, this opening statement, brings us to a different topic, or rather a development of my topic this evening, and that is the uses and abuses of science. I've indicated that we need science, it is our hope for the future, but it is also dangerous. Science is arguably the ultimate expression of what it is to be human and what it may be to be post-human. And it is also delivering what it may take to transcend, or at least change, human nature. So science both celebrates human nature as it is and looks forward to a different sort of nature that our descendants may have. But it is also the most valuable. It is, in this sense, it celebrates our curiosity as a species, and it is also, science is also the most valuable product of that curiosity. Science elaborates the state of our understanding of everything that human curiosity has revealed, and it helps us to be curious about new things. But of course, it also presents dangers. Many of you have lived through, as I did, the period in which, certainly in the 60s, I expected a disastrous nuclear war. I was in North America, in Canada, when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in 1963, and I expected the world to end within a few months. I expected there to be a disastrous nuclear war. Fortunately, that was averted. But that possibility alerted us, I think, as a species, to the possibility that we could be the cause of the end not only of our own existence, but possibly all life on Earth. Now, I want to use a more prosaic and contemporary example to illustrate some of the dangers and some of the opportunities that I think science presents to us. In 2011, two publicly funded research groups, one in Wisconsin in the United States and the other at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam here in Europe, analyzed and changed the structure of the avian flu virus, H5N1. They modified it so that previously H5N1 was only communicable by physical contact with infected birds, but they modified it so that it could be communicated in aerosol form, i.e. floating in the air, and could be breathed in. The Wisconsin group sent their paper to the famous journal Science, and the Rotterdam group sent their paper to Nature. And the editor of Science referred the paper to a body in America called the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, the NSABB. And the NSABB thought that this paper was dynamite because if you could produce an aerosol form of a deadly disease like avian flu, then this could be spread easily in populations and would appeal to bioterrorists as possibly a weapon of choice. There then ensued a very big debate about whether this work should be published or whether it should be published in what the Americans call redacted form. So if you think of the scientific papers are supposed not only to tell you what is possible, but to tell you how it's possible, so that other groups can repeat the work and see whether it is genuine. But of course, if you tell people how it's possible to change the virus to an aerosol form, then you tell them how to do it, if they're smart enough. So the danger was, should the papers be published, as they normally would, with the parts which explained the process present or blacked out, as it were, redacted. And this caused a very big discussion in the scientific world and in the ethical world. And I was privileged to be part of a huge 2-day meeting at the Royal Society in London, our National Academy of Science, which brought together all of the scientists involved, the team from Wisconsin, the team from Erasmus in Rotterdam. It brought together many experts on all forms of flu. It brought together 1 or 2 ethicists like me, and also the editors of Science and Nature were present. And the purpose of the meeting was to decide what should be done. Should the papers be published in their entirety? Does freedom of science require that? Or should they be published redacted with the naughty bits blacked out? Or should they not be published at all? And should we try to suppress this information? And the meeting revealed something very interesting, which I want to share with you now. There was a lot of debate about what should be done, and part of the paper I am presenting this evening, I presented to that meeting in London in 2012. And everything was very interesting, and it was pretty balanced between redaction and freedom of science, freedom to publish, until Barack Obama's advisor on biosecurity stood up to speak. And I will sort of paraphrase how his talk went. It's a wonderful talk. And by the way, if you're interested, if you go on the Royal Society website, which is very easy to find, Royal Society, into Google, and you put in H5N1, you can find the whole proceedings of that two-day meeting in video form, including my presentation, the best bit of the day, of course, but all of the others, and you can listen to it and watch it for yourself. Now, Obama's security chief, can I find his name? I like to attribute names to people. Yes, his name was Schneier. And he got up to speak, and he said, he looked at this room, 200 people, 7 or 8 Nobel Prize winners, some of the leading scientists in the world in the room. He looked around the room and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you look very boring. You have made the mistake of ceasing to be boring. Think about a street with houses. Some of them will have burglar alarms on the outside and some of them will not. Most burglars, thieves, ladri, are opportunistic. They will go first to the house with no protection. But if there's something very valuable in the house with the burglar alarm and the barbed wire, then a smarter group of thieves will want to go there." Now, he said, "You, ladies and gentlemen, have advertised the fact that you have something very valuable in your house, and I assure you that somebody like me, a digital security expert, can get access to it if he wants. Nothing in digital form is immune from hacking." And they said, "But we haven't published the papers yet. So if we don't publish them with the naughty bits, as I will call them, included, there's no problem, surely." And he said, "No, think about it." And he turned to the two editors of, the editor of Science and the editor of Nature, and he said, "Gentlemen, is it possible that papers are submitted to your journal online?" Ah, so the papers were submitted online before they were even considered, before the problems became apparent. It's too late. It's too late. They are already in digitized form. There is nothing you can do to stop a determined thief accessing them. Now that raises for me a very interesting point about the transformation. This is part of the point at which I want to interconnect science and democracy. The digitization of almost everything has been a game-changing development. Somebody mentioned that there is a video version of this. Some of you may be streaming what I'm saying onto the internet or tweeting parts of it at this very moment. This has changed the game for a reason that I need to go back a step to explain. The great English philosopher John Stuart Mill in the 19th century is famous for producing a principle of liberty. Basically, he said that everybody should have the maximum liberty which is compatible with everybody else having the same amount of liberty. But he also produced a gloss, a proviso, a caveat as to the scope of freedom of speech. And this is what he said: "No one pretends that actions should be as free as opinions. On the contrary, even opinions lose their immunity when the circumstances in which they are expressed are such as to constitute their expression a positive instigation to some mischievous act. By mischievous act, he meant act that ought to be prevented, illegal, and so on. And he went on, and this is a lovely example. He said, and I'll paraphrase here, he said, it's okay to think that corn dealers, people who sell the corn out of which bread is made, are thieves, are starvers of the poor, was the word that he used. Freedom of speech requires that you are free to say your opinion, that corn dealers are starvers of the poor. But you are not free to say it to an armed mob outside a corn dealer's house. That would be an instigation to violence against the corn dealer. So he both set out the nature of freedom of speech and its natural limit. And that caveat of his pretty much has worked since he uttered those words in the middle of the 19th century, in the 1850s. But now you never know what audience you are addressing. If I was saying corn dealers are thieves, somewhere in the world there is an armed, angry, drunken mob outside a corn dealer's house, and somebody's put it on the internet, and what I'm saying is an instigation to them to do violence. You can't rely on the limited nature of an address. So I speak to lots of audiences, not usually as intelligent and alert as you, but I'm always reasonably careful to think about the sort of audience that I'm talking to, and how much explanation, how much background, how much justification for what I say is required. But I've also had the experience of finding myself unknowingly addressing an audience that I didn't expect to be talking to. And I'll give you one other example of this. One of the things, in England, I will tell you about this because it's interesting intrinsically. In England, we have a wonderful organization called the Science Media Centre. It is a private charity which was set up to explain science to society. And when there was a controversy, when something that seemed to be shocking or dreadful that scientists were doing happened, experts would explain it and try to enable people to understand exactly what was being done and why it was being done. And I'm one of the people that the Science Media Centre sometimes contacts to explain science to society. And on an occasion recently, in the last 6 months, they asked me for a quotation on something that a drug company had done. I won't tell you the name of the drug company. It was Novartis, and it was doing something rather nasty. It was evergreening its patents, so that it was changing a molecule very slightly, repatenting the product so that it would get a further 30 years protection. And I said this was outrageous. My university also, because it's a very proud university, collects all of the information on its members of staff and the impact that they're having in society. So it produces statistics. Whenever somebody like me, who works for the University of Manchester, says something that is reported in the press office of the university gathers this and sees where it was reported. This remark of mine, which I made in a press release, admittedly, designed to be available to the public, I thought maybe would go into a serious weekly paper, possibly a few serious weekly journals, and that would be it. And I asked the press office, because I have to establish why I'm valuable to my university, and one of the reasons I might be valuable to them is that I get press attention. So I personally also like to know when I've said something that is reported. So I got the statistics on my quotation about Novartis, and my actual quotation had reached 36 million hits, with 5.5 million individual visitors. Now, perhaps you're not surprised, you are more sophisticated than me. I was staggered by that statistic. So something that I thought was addressing an audience of professional people reading serious weekly journals was reported globally in nearly 300 outlets worldwide and accessed by at least 5.5 million, probably 5.5 million different people. Now, it seems to me that that is a really game-changing phenomenon for freedom of speech, because you can no longer rely on Mill's argument that, okay, you can say things in one context but not in another. These days, not only do you not know where your remarks are going, even if they're signed remarks, they could be shown on TV, and you don't know who they're reaching. And as Eric Schmidt, the CEO of, I think he's still the CEO of Google, famously said, the internet has no delete button. Not only does it reach millions, but you can't retract it. You can't black it out as the journals Nature and Science were invited to do. So, we are now in a situation where two things, I think, have changed. The first is that there is no such thing anymore as a private conversation. Certainly there is no such thing as a private email or a private anything that is rendered into digital form. The security expert told the meeting, I assume it's true, that even if the contents of your personal computer had not been put on the internet, had not been communicated as an email, they could still be hacked. So most of us write, and some of us even think, onto our iPads or our phones. So everything is in principle accessible. That is the first problem. The second problem is that there are no second thoughts. It's too late for the editor of Nature or Science to decide that they won't publish something because it is dangerous, because it is not in the public interest. So this places a huge responsibility on scientists, like many people in this room, but also people like me who don't do any science but talk about it, and indeed on all citizens really, about the nature of what they say in contexts which, unbeknown to them, might prove to be public. I can talk to a small seminar in my university of my trusted PhD students, but who's tweeting Harris has come up with some new outrageous idea? And I might find it in the national papers before I've even decided whether it really is an idea that I want to spread. Because like many academics, I try my ideas out on my students, and sometimes even on unsuspecting audiences like you. And I need to see how they're received before I know whether I really want to maintain them or not. Okay, now in this discussion, I've often said we are in this situation. We are faced with whether or not to publish things, whether or not to consign things to digital form. Who is we? The question always arises, who decides? Who decides? And my answer to this in democracies, which fortunately your country and mine are almost, and I say that not about Italy, but about England, almost democracies, the question, who decides, is always the same. It is we, the citizens. We decide. We decide either because we vote people into office, or we decide, because having made the mistake of voting them into office, we do not take steps to ensure that they're removed. And of course, the Arab Spring and many other popular events globally have shown us that we don't actually have to wait for an election if things are bad enough. So the answer, who decides, is always the same. It's not the experts, it's not the government, it is us, the people, we, the citizens. So it's our responsibility. Now, there is a very seminal paper, which I quoted in this meeting at the Royal Society, which I want to quote to you now. It says something very interesting about this issue of freedom and democracy. It's a very famous academic paper. I'm sure you will all have heard of it. It is headed In Congress, July 4th, 1776. And it sets out, and I quote, certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, of course, that is the Declaration of Independence from my wicked country, England, by the then 13 United States. There were only 13 United States in those days. But it's not accidental that the concepts of liberty appears in this declaration, in these opening few lines that I've read to you, twice. First, as a so-called unalienable right, and second, implicit in the requirement that a legitimate government is necessarily a government by consent of the people. This means, in short, that it is our responsibility, yours and mine, as to what happens, including what happens in science and in art. Now, we started late, the whole day is running late. I promise you I will not go over time, but I will begin to wind up and speak probably for 6 or 7 minutes more only, I promise you. I want to go back a little earlier than John Stuart Mill in the 1850s. I want to go back to another English philosopher. We're very xenophobic, we English. Another English philosopher, the late, great Thomas Hobbes, in his wonderful book, The Leviathan. And in that wonderful book, Hobbes reminded us of the clear foundational obligations of any nation state, of any government. And this is what he said. The office of the sovereign, be it a monarch or an assembly, in Hobbes's day it was a king, but he means this to include parliaments as well. The office of the sovereign, be it a monarch or an assembly, consisteth in the end for which he was trusted with the sovereign power, namely the procuration of the safety of the people, to which he, the sovereign, is obliged by the law of nature. So Hobbes clearly says something that I believe to be one of the most profound insights into the scope and limits of government of any sort, is that the business of the state is the safety of the people. And Hobbes went on to qualify that remark in this way. The obligation of subjects, that's you and me, citizens, the obligation of subjects to the sovereign is understood to last as long and no longer than the power lasteth by which he is able to protect them. And Hobbes here is setting out one of the many versions of what is sometimes called in political philosophy social contract theory. He imagines that there is an implicit contract between the citizens and the government. And the deal is that the citizens only have to obey the government so long as the government, in its turn, protects them. Now, Hobbes was particularly worried about violent assaults and civil unrest, but the scope of his remarks is much more general. In our day, hopefully in your country and mine, government protection consists in providing hospitals and health care. It consists in providing relief for people who are very poor. It consists in providing social services and so on. That is the way in which a government discharges its obligation to protect the people. But it also, and this is something that was talked about in a number of presentations today, and some of the gentlemen who spoke in the last session, in the opening session at 5 o'clock, if you were here, were very keen to point out that Italy was very proud of the way that it is taking seriously the role of science in providing what is necessary to deliver at least part of the protection. In fact, one of the gentlemen, I can't remember which, talked about it in saying something like, science is necessary to drive the economy, but of course science is also necessary to drive healthcare and very many other things as well. So, where does this leave us? It seems to me that I usually like to deliver very clear answers in the way I do philosophy or bioethics. I usually don't try to answer a question unless I think I can offer a clear and concise solution. In this case, I don't think I can. It seems to me that we are in a new situation. We face many unprecedented dangers. If avian flu is not modified by scientists to an aerosol form, it might well mutate naturally into such a form. And the reason, of course, the justification for the work by the group in Wisconsin and the work by the group at Erasmus University was to make an aerosol form so that they could study it, so that if the virus mutated, they could think about the possibility of a vaccine or other preventive measures if it mutated naturally, and the same, of course, if it was deliberately changed by bioterrorists. So there was an altruistic motive to what they did. So we need science. We look to science for solutions to our problems. We look to science to find ways of, for example, avoiding large meteorite strikes on the Earth, which is a very big issue currently. We hope we can identify dangerous meteorites and possibly intercept them and change their course or obliterate them before they land. We are familiar with ever-increasing new diseases. In our own time, we've had variant CJD, we've had HIV/AIDS, and there will be many others. So we constantly are looking to science for remedies, not necessarily for existing problems, but for new problems. So we want flourishing science, but we also need responsible science. We also need to think about whether or not certain scientific work should be undertaken, because once undertaken, we may not be able to prevent it disseminating, however careful we are with our security measures through the internet, and being used by anybody at all. And we also value our freedom. It is our freedom that allows our curiosity free rein. I won't provide evidence for this, but it is well understood that directed science is not very productive. we need directed science, but even more, we need what's sometimes called blue sky science, science that is just curious and interested in why things happen and what makes them happen and what their basic structures are and so forth. And much of the most productive science is of that sort. So we're in this dilemma. It's impossible to set limits to what science should do in advance if we're to have a flourishing science. Once it has come up with solutions, it's impossible to keep it under wraps. And we need it to be free, but we also need somehow to provide checks and balances for the dangers that we humans, through science and technology, have placed ourselves in. The dangers of new diseases, the dangers of technologies that we can't control, and so forth. And finally, and this is not least for me, we need the sorts of free societies in which people can continue to make their own choices about life in the way that John Stuart Mill imagined. And I want to end, and this is the last remark I will make this evening. My host this evening was kind enough to mention a book that I'm writing at the moment called How to Be Good. One of the things I'm interested in writing that book is a new movement in both science and in ethics, which is called moral enhancement. It is the attempt to improve human beings' moral dispositions. So the argument goes that a lot of the problem is that we don't have enough sympathy, we don't have enough empathy, we have too much violence, we have too much aggression. If we could manipulate these motives, these mainsprings of action, so that people were less aggressive and more what social scientists, psychiatrists call pro-social, then morality would be improved. Now, I personally am worried about this because pro-sociality, that is to say, immediate sympathy for the distress of others, is not either necessarily good or indeed sufficient to be good. And I'll give you just one example or two examples and then close. Our violence and aggression and anger are useful. Very often they're good. Think about this. What would you be like as a person if you felt no anger, no resentment for somebody who caused unbearable pain or suffering to somebody that you loved? If that didn't make you angry, if that didn't make you feel aggressive towards them, what would you be like? What would your psychology be like? There's a very interesting paper by English philosopher Peter Strawson on this very subject. It's called Freedom and Resentment. It was published, I think, in the early 60s, and I recommend it to you. And he argued that we can't get rid of resentment without getting rid of love, and therefore we have to have both. And much as we might be ashamed of feeling too much resentment, to have none at all would make us a very different sort of person, arguably the sort of person that we would not want to be. I am suspicious about pro-sociality because it is designed to, it takes what may be a true hypothesis about the evolutionary origins of morality, namely that it arose in very primitive sharing behavior and what scientists call pro-social behavior between our ape ancestors and between our ancestors. And they are elevating that into, as it were, the key to morality. But the problem is that pro-sociality only operates on suffering or distress that you can see. It seems to me that what we need, that morality consists in not acting rightly to those in front of you necessarily, but acting rightly all things considered. And it may be that you ought to ignore the people suffering in front of you because there are more people suffering more out of sight and possibly out of mind elsewhere in your country or elsewhere in the world. So I am worried about this movement to engineer new moral attitudes by fiddling around with the levels of serotonin or oxytocin in the human brain. I could be wrong. It might be a jolly good thing to do, but I am concerned that it might leave us less free to make more rational decisions about what ought to be the proper object of our concern. Feelings cannot be enough. If somebody asks you why you did that, and it's morally important, it's a moral question, it's never enough to say, oh, I felt like it. You need to provide a justification, something that explains why what you felt like doing was the right thing to do. What seems right is not always what is right. And the example that I'll leave you with, I'm well under the hour, the example that I'll leave you with is this, and it's a historical example, but I think it's a very telling one. It occurred in 1940, I've not written it down in this paper, it occurred in 1944, I think, when you will all have heard of the ultra-secret. The ultra-secret was the German codes during the Second World War were called ultra. And British analysts at Bletchley Park broke this code in 1943. And of course kept the fact that they had broken the code. And Alan Turing, the famous mathematician, was one of those responsible for breaking this code. As a result of the British having access to the German military codes, Winston Churchill was given warning of a huge bombing raid that was to be directed against the city of Coventry. There was a particular individual called Winterbottom, F.W. Winterbottom, I don't know what his initials stand for, who was responsible for communicating between the codebreakers at Bletchley Park and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister in London. And he records in his autobiography the very conversation that he had with Churchill when he said, it looks as though Coventry will be bombed massively sometime after about between 5 hours from now and some later time. And Churchill had this dilemma. Should he try to evacuate Coventry? Should he try to increase the air defenses around Coventry? If he did so, it's probable, because it was only maybe as little as 5 hours warning, that he couldn't evacuate the city and that there would be panic. But should he try? Remember, these were his citizens for whom he was responsible, and he was going to have to go round Coventry the following morning if there was a bombing raid and show his concern for the citizens, knowing that he might have prevented many of those deaths. Or should he do nothing? If he did something, that would show the Germans that the codes had been broken and they would change the codes. If he did something, they may have changed their minds anyway, and there wouldn't have been a raid, and they still would have known, and no lives would have been saved. In the end, he didn't do anything. And the Coventry raid took place, and actually, I looked up the mortality figures. It wasn't nearly as high as I thought it was, but it was several hundreds of people were killed or very badly injured. If he had been, his oxytocin and serotonin levels had been manipulated, he might have been overwhelmed by sympathy for his own citizens, his in-group, at the expense of thinking about shortening the war and the number of lives that might be saved overall. I don't know whether Churchill made the right decision. I rather think he did. But I am pleased that he was able to consider it dispassionately and not as a result of increased medically engineered levels of sympathy. So I'm suspicious of that form of moral enhancement, although science may well deliver it very interestingly, is delivering it even now. I think the best sort of moral enhancement is cognitive enhancement, which we do have actually very powerful drugs to improve our cognitive performance. And that hopefully will give us better insight, better data processing, better memory, more capacity to envisage the results of different possible courses of action. So, to conclude, we live in dangerous times. It is in our interests to keep science going. It is in our interests to improve our technological capacity. We must do so ultimately because we won't have anywhere to live in the end, and we need to make ourselves more resilient, more healthy, more resistant to disease, and so forth. But we also need to find a way of regulating and harnessing some of the effects of science. And I include here the internet as one of the effects of science, and I include the sort of dangers that prompted the United States Committee to think about censoring those two scientific papers. This is a dilemma for us. It seems to me that there is no simple solution to that dilemma, but we somehow need to keep all the balls in the air. We somehow need to keep science going. We somehow need to keep our freedom. We somehow need to keep our capacity for independent decision-making. And we need to do all of this while being conscious that in the long term, time is short. Thank you very much.
Ci sono delle domande, sono ben accolte. Vorrei sapere se c'è la traduzione simultanea per le domande. Sì, ok. E quindi facciamo accomodare le persone qua magari? Sì. Se ci sono delle domande...
Yeah, there is translation. Yes, we have translation.
Sì. Nemmeno i ragazzi.
Shocked silence, I love it.
Would you like to add something else?
Well, I think I've rather spoilt the party by suggesting that this was a fairly insoluble dilemma. I would be very interested to know what you think should have been the result of the H5N1 meeting. What should they have done? I think nothing has been done as far as I know. Does anybody know whether the papers have finally been published in Science? I haven't looked, and Nature, I haven't looked recently. I think that was a really hard nut to crack, not least because of the very helpful remarks of Obama's chief of data security. Well, I think we can all go and have a well-deserved drink. If there are no... There's somebody there. Yes.
Okay.
Are you going to ask the question in English or in Italian?
Italian. Allargando leggermente l'argomento, come pensi, visto che hai pensato tante cose, che possa cambiare il concetto stesso di democrazia, ora che c'è la possibilità di sapere tutti tutto in tempo reale. Io penso che il concetto di democrazia in se stesso è un po' cambiato.
I think that is a huge opportunity, but an even bigger danger. Because the temptation, which many governments, and I think your people in Italy are also flirting with this idea, is to have a sort of permanent plebiscite, a sort of permanent consultation of the people via the internet. Now, most of our democracies, I mean, I'm not an expert on democratic theory, I should say, but most of the democracies of the West are so-called representative democracies. That is to say, they are not direct democracies. We elect people to act on our behalf and to use their judgment, and indeed, it's part of certainly our constitutional assumption, though it's not an arrangement, that the government will not always consult the people. Indeed, it's one of the great virtues of certainly democracy in my country that we don't consult the people. The government doesn't consult the people on everything. It consults the people dutifully and reliably every 4 years. And we have, I think so far, since the war at least, and probably before that, never had a prime minister that changed the law to keep themselves in power longer than was permitted. But we don't consult them on everything. It's well understood in England that, for example, the majority of people would like the return of capital punishment, would like the return of the death penalty, but Parliament won't do it. Parliament won't do it. And I, for one, am relieved, not simply because I'm against the death penalty, but I think that is a proper exercise of the delegated power that we give through our democratic process. John Stuart Mill, who I referred to earlier among many people, have warned against what he called the tyranny of the majority. Democracy is not the same as the tyranny of the majority. It is not the same as majoritarian rule, because democracies are also governed by constitutional considerations, whether it is a written constitution, as in the United States, or one that is not written, as in the United Kingdom, and I don't actually know about Italy, I'm sorry to say, whether you have a written constitution or not. But there are both moral and constitutional constraints upon what governments and indeed what people may do. These are partially to protect minorities, they are partially to give time for consideration and so forth. So I, for one, am very suspicious and worried about moves to more so-called direct democracy. I think the safer guarantee, although this is just my personal opinion, and it is not particularly informed by any academic expertise that I have, but my personal opinion is that there is a big danger of a tyranny of the majority in so-called direct democracy, and we should be very concerned about that prospect. I don't know if that answers your question, but that is one of my fears. I think much better guarantee is to make sure we can always replace the governments when we want to. And, well, I was about to sing the praises of a first-past-the-post system like we have in England, because it avoids certain problems that are evident in other countries, but it also has its drawbacks, so I won't say any more about that. So, lady in the middle.
Grazie, in italiano. Io vorrei ritornare un attimo sul discorso di internet, perché mi sembra molto importante, non soltanto per quanto riguarda sì, la scienza, ma anche sull'espressione della libertà. Lei ha detto che internet comunque non rende, sembra, almeno quello che ho capito io, non rende veramente la libertà, nel senso che la pubblicazione anche di riviste scientifiche comunque può essere, si può creare il problema che può essere ridotta, diciamo che non si può dire magari tutta la verità su certi argomenti oppure no, però dall'altro canto vediamo che internet comunque ha reso la libertà un valore magari molto più importante, perché tramite internet molti giovani hanno avuto la possibilità di rendere, di pubblicare le proprie esperienze, di potersi esprimere, e quindi da un lato vediamo che c'è la libertà espressa, dall'altro invece sembra che in questa conferenza la libertà sia un po' negata. Lei cosa ne pensa? Forse se posso avere una spiegazione più specifica riguardo al concetto di libertà nella scienza e in internet. Grazie.
That's a very good and complicated question. If you think that freedom may be the freedom to do what you want. We don't always know what we want, and part of the process of deciding what we want is, as it were, to rehearse with ourselves different ideas, different possibilities. When I'm writing a paper on a particular subject, I often don't know what I think about it. I have to, if I published every first thought I had, I would probably never get to the end. So I think there is, while freedom consists in doing what you want is not always the first thing, as it were, that comes into your head, or for that matter, that goes onto your keypad or goes onto the internet. There's a quite an instructive social psychological theory, which is, I think, derives from, although he borrowed it from other people, but Erving Goffman. Some of you may know him, an American theorist, who talked about the dramaturgical model of social life. And what he suggested was that living is like a drama, like putting on a play. But first you have to rehearse. You have to feel comfortable in your role. You have to know how you wish to present yourself to others, and what you do in order to be comfortable with how you wish to present yourself, including your ideas to others, is to try them out in private first, to see how they go down, to see what other people's reactions are. Now, if we don't have the privacy to do that, if everything goes immediately public, immediately onto the internet, if people just stream their thoughts, very often including their prejudices, for all the world to see and understand, I'm not sure that that constitutes freedom. Although I wouldn't legislate, I wouldn't make it unlawful to do that. I think we should be thoughtful, circumspect about whether that is the right thing to do. There is another model of privacy that is sometimes used, and it is used actually to protect personal sexuality. It's the remark that what goes on in the bedroom is private. What goes on behind the bedroom door is private. What you do there is up to you. Now, there is, if you like, an intellectual equivalent of that in terms of thoughts and feelings and modes of expression. And I think that's valuable. I think it doesn't mean you're not entitled to open the bedroom door if you want everybody to see, but it is often prudent not to do so. And therefore, something that makes it automatic, that makes it expected, that everything will be out there, I think is worrying, although I should emphasize a distinction that is often overlooked. That if I say that I think something is unwise or even unethical, I don't mean that it should be made unlawful. There is a big gulf between what is unethical and what should be unlawful. There are many things that are perfectly lawful, which I think are positively wicked, but I spent a lot of my time defending people's rights to be wicked within certain limits if they so choose. So also we have to be careful what we mean by something that is unwise. If I say something is unwise, I don't mean that you should be prevented from doing it, but I'm not sure that it's a good thing. Now, the other thing worries me about the internet is this will sound terribly, I can't find a way of making this sound other than elitist, but I don't intend it to be, and that may strike you as not very plausible. But not everybody's opinion is as good as everybody else's. Opinions are good in proportion to the evidence and argument that support them. What the internet has encouraged is the idea that whatever anybody says is just as good as what anybody else says. That is simply a false view. Views are, as it were, have to be sustainable. A view to be respectable, if it's about anything important, certainly if it's about something ethical, has to be defended, justified by a combination of evidence and argument. And just streaming what you feel about something is no more respectable of itself than just doing what you feel like doing, even if it hurts other people and so on. The fact that you feel like doing it or feel like saying it is not sufficient justification. It may be sufficient for us not to make it unlawful. That is a different issue. I hope that's part of an answer to your question.
Altre domande? Sì. Professor Harris, intanto quando uscirà il suo libro?
I don't know who asked that question, but no, I don't have a date. I expect to finish it in July. I probably will be published, I hope, by either Christmas or January, probably by next Christmas. But who knows? I've written 55,000 words out of an expected 70,000 words, so it's almost there.
Buonasera, anche io in italiano. Vorrei tornare sulla questione dell'aviaria. Vorrei tornare sulla questione dell'aviaria, probabilmente su quello che doveva essere pubblicato su Nature o sull'altra rivista scientifica. Questo dibattito sull'aviaria vedo molte similitudini su quello che è successo sul nucleare. Il nucleare visto in modo positivo o negativo, cioè per l'utilizzo dell'energia oppure per la distruzione dell'umanità. Lo stesso riguarda per l'aviaria. È giusto pubblicare o non...
Scusi, penso che dovrebbe avvicinare il microfono.
Scusi.
Grazie.
Il fatto che sia giusto pubblicarlo o non pubblicarlo, io credo che la scienza non si debba troppo preoccupare di questo, nel senso che altrimenti la scienza si fermerebbe. Se si fermasse a decidere quali siano gli argomenti pericolosi per l'umanità in un contesto in cui la scienza, ogni scoperta scientifica diventa pericolosa per l'umanità, per quanto riguarda sia le neuroscienze, sia per quanto riguarda la transgenetica o via dicendo, livello di genoma, livello che ogni ritrovamento scientifico ci butta in un vuoto dove non conosciamo esattamente quali possono essere le conseguenze a livello dell'umanità stessa, dell'uomo. Quindi come siamo sopravvissuti al nucleare, come lei ricordava nel 1968 c'era questa grande paura, dobbiamo avere fiducia che di sopravvivere a ogni scoperta scientifica, continuamente. Io penso questo. Poi chiudo qui, volevo vedere se era d'accordo con me in pratica.
There is a sign that you can sometimes see above the bar in many American bars, and it refers to the fact that American dollars have the legend "In God We Trust" written on them, and the sign says, "In God we trust, others pay cash." Now, in order to know whether it is rational to trust that everything will be okay, we have to have a pretty powerful futurology mechanism, which I think we lack. My instinct is along the lines that you've suggested. My instinct, I'm normally quite pro-science. I think it's doing a pretty good job, but it's not a blank check, as we say. It is not, and I would be happier if I felt more comfortable that there was not a great deal of luck in, for example, the fact that we avoided nuclear war in 1963, or indeed that other disasters that have looked pretty bad have not occurred. But I'm certainly not in favor of trying to control science more tightly. But I think there is the way I would like to go about regulating science is via self-regulation. But in order to have self-regulation, and this may be unpopular with many of the scientists in the room, you have to have good ethical education for scientists, which almost nowhere in the world exists at all. About 30 years ago in the United Kingdom, we started having ethical education for doctors, for medical practitioners, and it was long overdue. Very few universities in the United Kingdom provide ethical education for life scientists, for example, or indeed physicists, or anything else. If we expect scientists to behave responsibly, they have to have some idea of what behaving responsibly might be like. And I'm not fully satisfied that that is a universal part of scientific consciousness. Now, that sounds very pompous, but so I would like to leave it to scientists, and I would certainly not like to make it a matter of regulation. Top-down regulation of that sort is almost always disastrous. But I think if science wants to maintain the freedom that, as your insight suggests, and mine slightly less optimistic, but is also suggesting, if science is doing a pretty good job and wishes to be left free to continue to do that job, then they have to demonstrate the capacity, if you like, to think about their responsibilities rather more than scientists seem to do at the moment. And I, of course, exempt all of the distinguished scientists in this room from that calumny, that slander. Goodness me. People have woken up. I'm very pleased to say there's a gentleman in the front here. This is frightening.
In English.
Thank you.
A light question. How a foreign observer, what do you think about the movement, the Italian movement, that believes only on web democracy? Is a real democracy? There is a similar movement in England. Thank you.
Well, as I think I said in my remarks, I would like a sight of the theory of democracy that sustains that opinion. Most theories of democracy set limits to what even a democratic process may be permitted to do. For example, the persecution of minorities, which majorities very often want to do. And we have very recent historical examples, some current, of the continuing tendency for the majority in certain political and possibly even social situations to wish to persecute minorities. If we don't want a world in which there is freedom to do that, that shows that we think that there are limits to what people may choose to do legitimately. And indeed that goes for individual choice as well. The criminal law in every community is designed precisely to set limits to what individuals may do. Now, it would be very ironic if a majority of individuals wanted to do those same wicked things that were forbidden to individuals, that somehow would make it okay. On the assumption that it wouldn't make it okay, we need to have some theory of democracy that caters for that possibility. So that's why I would prefer to stick with representative democracy.
Sempre sul tema della democrazia, chiedevo questa cosa qui. Mi sembra come se lei prima, mi sembra di aver capito che in qualche modo ha detto che non è una testa un voto, o perlomeno ogni argomentazione non è uguale all'altra, no? Quindi diciamo in qualche modo, facendo una forzatura, magari potremmo dire che quasi ogni testa non è un pensiero, non è un voto, non ha lo stesso peso. E a questa affermazione io ho creduto che possa essere, anche se diciamo un po' dura, però reale. Parlando di temi tecnici è difficile prendere una decisione per una persona che si occupa magari di altre materie riguardo al nucleare, a cosa, se è buono, se è una cosa cattiva, no? C'è molto, forse una testa, un voto può essere per una cosa di morale, dove è più un'opinione strettamente relativa alla persona, e via via su argomenti più tecnici o più specifici, o dove c'è bisogno di una maggiore conoscenza, chiamiamola cultura, è più difficile avere tutti lo stesso peso, e quindi questa democrazia diretta è meno efficiente di una democrazia rappresentativa, mi sembrava di aver capito, e posso condividere questo. Se non vivessi in Italia, dove abbiamo qualche problemino, no? E al di là della cosa spicciola, però mi sembra che poi tutto questo è un gioco di equilibri fatto di 1000 fili, dove ci deve essere sì il momento del voto, sì il momento in cui uno assiste alle diverse opinioni degli eventuali rappresentanti, sì a un giornalista che magari deve fare un'indagine giornalistica e vedere quello stesso fatto sotto altri aspetti, sì magari a una Costituzione che pone dei limiti a questo, e poi c'è anche, sappiamo, dei conflitti di interessi che ci sono, quindi come può essere una figura, no, forte per 20 anni, soltanto in Italia questo succede. Ecco, quindi una democrazia che è una parola forte ma che è tanto debole da tenere in equilibrio.
You said many interesting things, some of which I think I disagree with, but probably not the main thing. But just let me concentrate on the idea of one person, one vote, which you, if the translation was correct, and I'm sure it was, is something that you said several times. Every statement in a natural language, Italian, English, any natural language, is necessarily ambiguous, may mean more than one thing. The statements of God, of course, assuming there is a God, which I certainly don't, are also ambiguous. That is why we have theology, to interpret the alleged statements of God. So for every statement like one man, one vote, there are many things that it might mean. And so before I even signed up to a principle like one person, one vote, I would like to unpack a little more what that might be meant by that. Now, in theory, we're all Democrats in favor of that. That means that some people don't get no votes, unless, of course, they're children, and that may be unjust, or foreigners, and that may be unjust. But also, of course, when do they have that vote? We don't want governments who, when they lose an election, say, right, we'll just run the election again, and we'll go on running the election again, one person, one vote, until we get the right answer. So even something as simple as one person, one vote is not very simple. It is constrained by all sorts of constitutional arrangements, including the frequency of elections, including what happens when there are ties and so forth, including regulations about recounts. So I like to know what I'm signing up to when I sign up to a slogan, and I'm not very keen on necessarily just writing a blank check for that slogan. The other thing that I think you said, if I understood it correctly, which I would like to take issue with, there's much I agreed with, is I think you implied, if I heard you or heard the translation correctly, that in the case of morality, everything is a matter of personal opinion. I certainly don't agree with that. I think morality is as objective as science. I could explain that, but it would take quite a long time. But I can give you one insight into why I think it's pretty objective. Everybody thinks, I hope everybody thinks, almost everybody thinks, that it is wrong to cause harm and suffering to another person who doesn't deserve harm and suffering. And everybody has a very good way of deciding which are the worst harms and which are the less bad harms. These are perfectly objective matters. There are occasionally disagreements, very occasionally. But if you think of how to analyze harm in this way, I'll give you a rough and ready guide to just decide what's harmful. I call a harmed condition, I've written about this in my book about 3 books ago called Wonder Woman and Superman. It's one of my few books which is translated into Italian, so you have no excuse for not going out and reading it. In that book, I define harm as any condition which a rational person would wish not to be in. And then I further define what that means by saying, suppose somebody were admitted into the emergency room of a hospital in a condition, doesn't matter what the condition is, in a condition that was reversible, and they were unconscious. But the condition could only be reversed if it was done immediately. So you can't ask them whether they want it to be reversed or not. Of course, there are trivial conditions and there are serious conditions. And I think we would get pretty good consensus as to how urgent it was to reverse that condition. And even if it was something relatively trivial, if I was admitted to hospital with the last segment of the little finger of my left hand severed, of course my life would be perfectly okay. I could manage without that. I probably wouldn't, I'd think, oh God, thank goodness I only had such a small injury. But nonetheless, we can see why even an injury as small as that should be reversed, and indeed why the hospital staff would be negligent, wrongful, if they didn't reverse that condition, if they didn't sew it back on for you, without having to ask whether you wanted it sewn back on or not. I think there is massive consensus about that. If I gave 50 things that if I was all-powerful, which I of course aspire to be, 50 things that I could do to you now, which you probably wouldn't like, I bet you could rank order them in levels of undesirability pretty accurately, and I think I would expect pretty universal agreement on that. I think morality is pretty objective. There are doubtful cases, but there aren't many. If somebody tells you something, this happened to me today. You know immediately whether to say, oh, that was nice, or whether to say, oh, what a pity. We don't have much disagreement about that. So I don't think morality is actually highly subjective at all.
Buonasera, in base all'ultimo intervento adesso in risposta al signore e ripensando a quello che ha detto sullo sviluppo del pensiero prosociale o Gehring e le riserve, e allora vi chiedo se questo sviluppo poi del pensiero non possa essere più unitario, cioè sviluppare un pensiero complesso in cui ci siano le componenti creative, logiche e caring. E poi volevo proprio chiedere un chiarimento, parlava di sostanze per sviluppare questo pensiero. E se siamo quindi a livello di assunzioni, di farmaci, oppure volevo anche un chiarimento su questo. Basta.
Obviously one should never make asides in a presentation, because I didn't say enough about moral enhancement really to justify what I said, and you're quite right in suggesting that I would want to make all sorts of distinctions. If I was going to give an analysis of the components of a moral judgment, I would say that a large part is cognitive, but we also need things like imagination, insight. Certainly lack of sympathy is not a good thing, and so on. What I was suggesting is that the only component of the sorts of moral enhancement that are currently being talked about in the literature are affective, are emotional components. And I think that is radically insufficient. But I didn't have the opportunity to fill out in more detail what I would regard as a more complete picture of ethical judgments. But I do think that they are that. They are judgments, not simply feelings. But they are judgments which have as their component parts also affective, as we call them, considerations, emotions, insight, and so forth. As to the things, yes, again, the current candidates in the literature for morally enhancing molecules or drugs, if you like, are those that affect rather primitive responses like prosociality. These, I think, are inadequate. There may be other ones coming along which are much better. Now, I also spoke about cognitive enhancing drugs. I do know quite a lot more about those, and I could tell you a bit about them and which ones are available at the moment, and you can get half of them on the internet. Although in England it would be illegal, so I couldn't possibly recommend them to you.
Ok. Bene, ringraziamo il professor Harris, grazie mille anche a voi per aver dato vita a questo dibattito molto animato.
Thank you very much.